Hey guys, today I'm going to be presenting on schema therapy. It is theory that I've been studying for the past couple weeks and have really enjoyed studying and hope to use in a practice one day. So I hope you find it interesting. Um, and I hope you like it as much as I do. So we're going to begin with the history of schema therapy. So it's created by Jeffrey Young in the 1990s. This theory was developed from Young's curiosity about how to treat those who were resistant to CBT. So a lot of those people that were resistant to CBT ended up being a good fit for the description of someone with a personality disorder, so such as borderline personality disorder in general. And he found that treating these people involved a longer style of treatment and a more deep dive into their childhood experiences. So he incorporated many techniques from Gestalt and emotion-focused therapies. And the result was an integrative psychotherapy in which maladaptive schemas, which we'll talk about in the next slide, what those are, could be identified and confronted. So also I bought this book that's on the left here. It is the most updated version of Jeffrey Young's guide to schema therapy. It is very straightforward and very helpful. If you're interested in this type of therapy, I really recommend getting it. You can get it on Amazon. It's a really great book to have around. So what is schema therapy? This is going to be a pretty broad generalization on what schema therapy is because it is very unique in the way that it's organized. It has its own like 18 schemas and 18 schema domains, which we'll kind of get into, but not all the way. So if you're really curious, ask me. I would love to talk about it, or yeah, buy a book. It's based on the idea that we form early maladaptive schemas, which these early schemas shape how we see the world. The definition of them being a self-defeating emotional and cognitive pattern that begins in early development and repeats throughout life. And you can have multiple of these. You're not locked into one. It's not like the Myers-Briggs or the Enneagram where you like take the test and then you're like one of them. You can have many of these schemas in many of the schema domains. So it's really just about figuring out what your top schemas are. So there are 18 schemas grouped into 5 schema domains. So basically 18 categories or 5 categories in which we could believe things about ourselves in the world, and 18 things sorted through those, like getting more specific. So schema therapy also focuses on schema modes, which is very important. Schema mode would be, so an example of a schema would be feeling like one of the domains is feeling like one's need for connections not met. So then what do we do based on that would be our schema mode. So do we withdraw? Do we overattach? Do we engage? It'd be kind of how we operate based on that schema. And they can change quickly. They're not locked in and solid. But if we can identify how we're behaving based on what we believe, then we have some hope in getting through that. So the 3 identified broad modes include child modes, maladaptive parent modes, maladaptive coping modes, and then there is also the healthy adult mode, which is what we want to help clients get to in therapy. So this is just a little bit more of a visual for how we go from childhood experiences to believing maladaptive schemas because of those childhood experiences to behaving or cognitively behaving in those schema modes. So what do we do based on what we believe about the world based on what happened to us or what we were told in our childhood? So the nature of the counseling relationship when we're working through things like this, there's 2 big components, and that is limited reparenting and empathetic confrontation. They see in schema therapy that the client-therapist relationship is very important, just as in many types of therapy, but it's especially important to establish that rapport when you're working with those with personality disorders, just to get into a circle of trust with them before you begin going into education about schema therapy or things like that. So the therapist is also acting as an educator. So there's a lot to educate on when you're teaching about what is a schema mode, how does it work. But limited reparenting, that helps, that is to help counteract early maladaptive schemas. So it's kind of where the therapist fills in for where the parent or the caregiver or whoever has lacked in that person's childhood. So for instance, and it's limited because obviously it's within the confines of a therapist-client relationship, so it cannot be more of a parent relationship like that. And so an example of that would be if a client came to you and said, yeah, my parents, they just never offered me any help as a child. I felt like I was always on my own, when it came to my needs and what I was supposed to do and things like that. Then, that therapist would recognize that attributed to a certain schema, and that if they could offer some guidance within the therapeutic relationship, it would kind of help reparent that part of the client. So offering them what maybe they haven't been able to have. So the therapist and also uses empathetic confrontation, which is really just a dance between being kind and warm and understanding of the hurt that the client has experienced due to their schemas, but also confronting the schema. So if we were too empathetic with the client, then we would never get to the root cause of being that we needed to address. And if we only got to the root cause, then our client may not be receptive to that. So we want to be able to balance both. So who does schema therapy serve? So the original population that schema therapy was created to serve was those with personality disorders, particularly borderline personality disorder. So it's still used for that today. A study in 2020 showed that it is very helpful in reducing symptoms for those with borderline personality disorder, because it targets those individuals' emotional instability by teaching them to monitor those schema modes and behaviors as they happen. And as schema therapy has grown, they found more uses for it, such as treatment of OCD, anxiety disorders, and PTSD, because those things can also be resistant to CBT if they're really deeply embedded. And there's a lot of value in figuring out the maladaptive schemas that could cause these behaviors, such as OCD, anxiety, PTSD. I've personally been treated with schema therapy for OCD and anxiety, so I really find it helpful, and it was really interesting learning the science behind them. So the therapeutic process, there is 3 phases to the therapeutic process. There's the assessment and education phase, and the change phase, and the behavioral pattern breaking phase. So in the assessment and education phase, the therapist is identifying patterns, identifying maladaptive schemas, identifying coping skills by listening to the client, doing intake, learning how this client sees the world, learning how they see themselves, while also establishing that relationship with the client. So establishing that trust that when the therapist is ready to confront and the client is ready for the therapist to confront that schema, they trust the therapist to do so. So the change phase is where the strategies really come in, the cognitive and experiential strategies. So there's 2 that are used a lot, for example, in schema therapy, and that is chair work and imagery rescripting. There's a lot of research on both of those, that schema therapy research that talks about using both of these, as well as originally in Jeffrey Young's book. These were 2 of the big ones as well. So there's chair work, which is where if I had a maladaptive schema mode that I would get into, then I could recognize that and recognize that I was being triggered. Then I would sit in a chair and speak to myself as a healthy adult, speak to my schema mode and schema as a healthy adult, then speak back as the schema and what I've been believing, and do rapport between my healthy self, my unhealthy self with that schema embedded. And then imagery rescripting would be, it kind of reminds me of EMDR without the eye movement. It's kind of going back and recalling those traumatic memories and traumatic events that have happened or things like that, and drawing a different conclusion about it, while also not denying that the event happened, but and then also being able to react to it if we haven't had the space or didn't have the space back then to react, kind of giving some space to process what has been felt, while also kind of rewriting that memory, and drawing a different conclusion about it. So once that has been done and it is, schemas have been well identified and a client can identify their schema when they're triggered specifically, that's when the behavior pattern breaking really comes in, which is, the most important part of treatment. So that is when, a client is ready to go out into the world and start kind of recognizing when they're triggered and using some coping skills to get out of that schema mode that they've been able to identify. So it takes a long time, a lot of work, a lot of commitment from the client. So that's usually the longest, phase. And but it can really help people when they get, familiar with how they react and can start breaking those patterns. So that is the basis of schema therapy. There's a lot to it. And so if you have any questions, feel free to ask me at any point, in the discussion board or, through email or text. I'd love to talk about it. So thank you guys so much and have a great night.